By the end of this video, you'll know what you as a parent can do to support your child in getting the top grades in their GCSEs and A-levels. There's only around 2.5 months left until the start of the exam season, and so it's really time to kind of pick up and start actually revising properly. Now, the fact that you clicked on this video tells me something about you as a parent, which is you actually want the best for your child, and you also want to support them in doing that. Which is why by the end of this video, you'll know exactly what you need to do to support them. Now, this is kind of a basic overview of the stuff that I teach in my coaching program, which I'll talk about later on. This is kind of the theory, but in the program, I actually help the students implement a lot of this stuff. And so let's just get started then. Now, before we talk about how to actually study for GCSEs and A-levels, we need to talk about something extremely important, which is GCSEs and A-levels are a competition. By nature, they are a competition. And just look at grade boundaries. The way grade boundaries work is that the top 5% of students across the world will get 9s or get A stars. And then there's boundaries for the rest of the grades as well, which means that on any given year, an exam could be really hard or an exam could be really easy, but it doesn't really matter because what really matters is how your child does compared to other students. Now, why do I actually mention that they are a competition? Well, because I'm not sure if you did your GCSEs or A-levels or maybe you did a different system, but over the past couple of years, GCSEs and A-levels have changed a lot. And that's mostly due to technology. It's mostly due to the internet and more recently AIs like ChatGPT, for example. And so what's happened is that the threshold to actually get the top grades has increasingly gotten higher and higher. Now a student needs to do way more than what they used to do back in the day to get the top grades. And the reason I say that is because what might have worked for you back in the day doesn't work now at all. In fact, it's a completely different ballgame. So GCSEs and A-levels are a competition, and we need to be doing what 95% of other students aren't doing for your child to get the top grades. And so the question is, well, what do they need to be doing to beat the competition? And that's exactly what I'll share. And stick around to the end as well, because that last one is something that a lot of people overlook. But let's just get started with the foundations, which is before we even talk about revision or anything, how's their lifestyle? Parents and students almost always just jump to the revision techniques themselves, but have we actually addressed the lifestyle factors? And I'll give you an example. Your child can have the most advanced techniques in the world. They could go to the best school in the world. They could have the best tutors. But if they're only sleeping 5 hours a day, they are not getting the top grades. There are foundations that need to be there. There's prerequisites before we actually get the top grades. And sleep is one of them. In fact, it's the most important thing. Number one right here. Is their sleep actually good? Are they sleeping consistently? Are they sleeping at least 7 hours a day? That's one of the factors. Another factor is exercise. People really overlook this, but exercise has a lot of cognitive benefits, mental health benefits, physical benefits, and all of that ties together to kind of create this archetype of a student that is able to get the top grades. But if your child is not active at all, then that's going to have a mental toll on them, and so they might not even be able to get the top grades. And the last thing is phone usage. More recently, through the introduction of TikTok and Instagram Reels and YouTube Shorts and all of those garbage apps, what's happened is that a lot of people, a lot of students, unfortunately, have been addicted to their phones. They use their phones more and more, and what that does is that it increases the threshold of dopamine in their brains. And so what that means is that studying is just not engaging anymore. Imagine your child being bombarded with a lot of dopamine-heavy content, whether it's on TikTok or YouTube or Instagram Reels. They're not then able to study because it's just not engaging enough. Their brain is used to a certain level of dopamine, and when they go below that level, they're not going to be able to focus. So those are the 3 lifestyle factors that I want you to focus on: sleep, exercise, and phone usage. And when you dial those in, we can then start talking about the revision itself. Now, the way I like to explain stuff is that there's 4 parts to acing any exam. If your child wants to get the top grades, there's only 4 things they need to take care of. Number 1, actually understanding the content. Number 2, recalling the content. Number 3, applying the content. And number 4, managing their time in the exam. Now, why do I mention these 4? Well, unfortunately, a lot of students and a lot of parents as well, when they see their children struggling with their grades, what they do is that they'll just get them a tutor. And to an extent, that could help. However, it only actually addresses 1 out of the 4 parts to acing the exams. When you get a tutor, what are you basically saying? You're basically saying, my child doesn't really understand the content that well, and so I need a tutor to help explain that content to them. However, what if the problem isn't actually understanding? What if your child is just struggling with actually recalling the content in the exam? Or what if they understand and they can recall it, but they're just not able to apply it in the right way? Or maybe they have all of those 3 in check, but they just can't manage their time. And so a lot of parents make this mistake where as soon as they see their children struggling, they'll just call up a tutor and spend a lot of money on that tutor. When in reality, the tutor does what school already does. And the tutor does what ChatGPT also already does. It explains the content. But there's 3 other parts that are often neglected, which we'll talk about later on as well. So just to recap, if you want your child to get the top grades, they can't only focus on understanding the content. They also need to be able to recall the content. They need to be able to apply the content, and they need to be able to manage their time in the exam itself. Now you might be asking, okay, I get it. Understanding the content, we do that through schools and tutors and ChatGPT and all that stuff. How do they actually recall the content? How do they apply it? How do they manage their time? Now I've made hundreds of videos talking about all three of those. However, I'll just give you a quick recap. If you want to recall the content, basically memorization, which we'll talk about later on as well through this Venn diagram, then the best thing they could do is using flashcards. Now, there's a lot of intricacies and a lot of details when it comes to actually using flashcards and how to use it properly. However, just as a brief, using flashcards is exactly what they need to recall the content. Awesome, they now understand the content and they can recall it, but how do they actually apply it in the exam? Well, your child will do that through as many practice questions as possible. If they want to know what the examiner expects, then they need to expose themselves to as many mark schemes as possible, which basically means they just need to do as many practice questions as possible. Now again, there's a lot of intricacies when it comes to doing practice questions. When are you supposed to do them? How exactly do you do them? However, just as a brief, practice questions for applying the content, memorization for recalling the content, and then managing their time. This is also technically under applying the content because you manage your time by exposing yourself to as many situations as possible where you need to manage your time. For example, if your child kind of struggles with managing their time in a unit test or a mock or an exam, what they could do is put themselves in that position as often as possible. So instead of just doing practice questions aimlessly, kind of taking 2 hours to do a 30-minute paper, then they need to do it under exam conditions instead. And what that does is that it primes their brain to work under those conditions. Because unfortunately, what a lot of students do is that the only time they'll actually experience exam conditions is during an exam. And that's a recipe for failure. And so to manage their time effectively, they need to do exam questions under exam conditions. Now, so far we've talked about a lot of theory, and maybe you're a parent that as soon as you kind of listen to a lot of this, it makes sense and you're able to apply it with your child. But I've worked with a lot of students as well where their parents agree with a lot of this stuff, however, they just can't seem to help them implement it properly. And that's where my coaching program comes in. So I've recently launched the Exam Excellence Blueprint. It's a 6-week coaching program where I help your child get the top grades in their GCSEs and A-levels. It's not a program where I actually tutor your child because, let's be honest, school does that, tutoring does that, ChatGPT could already do that. And so through the program, your child will have one-on-one guidance where they're able to know exactly what to do, exactly how to study for every single subject because the exam season is only in 2.5 months. And so there isn't really much time to kind of mess around and waste. Every single day matters from now on. And so it's important for your child to start as soon as possible and start in a way that actually makes sense rather than wasting a lot of time just kind of messing around. If that's something that interests you, then go ahead and check the first link in the description and we could talk more. Now, we talked about the 4 parts of acing the exam. However, every single subject is different. And that's a very important principle. Every single subject is different, which means that the way we approach every single subject will also be different. Now, the question is, okay, how do I actually differentiate between the subjects? What makes them different? I could tell that maths is different than chemistry and that's different than biology, but how are they actually different? We do that through this Venn diagram right here. This is a very simple Venn diagram. It's basically just essay writing, memorization, and problem solving. Now, any subject that you can think of that your child can take in their GCSEs or A-levels, bar subjects like music and arts and drama where there's a lot of actually performing, any subject that is academic will fall somewhere in this Venn diagram. For example, maths, problem solving. There isn't really that much memorization and there's no essay writing at all. When it comes to physics, it will be a mix of problem solving and memorization. Biology, also a mix of problem solving and memorization, however, more towards the memorization side. English, a mix of essay writing and memorization, and so on. Now, the reason we actually break down the subjects into the core elements is because that will give us a blueprint on how to actually study for each subject based on the elements, rather than just approaching it in a way that's not systematic. Now, you might say, awesome, I understand the differences between each subject, but how does my child actually approach the subjects differently? Now again, I've made a lot of videos talking about each element and exactly how you could approach subjects that have those elements. But just to keep it brief again, with memorization, like we talked about, it will be flashcards. Flashcards is all your child needs to actually memorize the content properly. And as long as they do flashcards properly, in a systematic way, a way that actually works, that implements active recall and spaced repetition, then flashcards is all they need for memorization. And you'd be surprised how powerful flashcards actually are. When it comes to problem solving, again, kind of just the same as applying the content. When it comes to problem solving, it's about doing as many practice questions as possible, but not just aimlessly doing practice questions. They have to do practice questions in the proper way as well. And then essay writing, there's really 2 parts. The first part is actually understanding the essay that you're writing. What is the examiner looking for? How do they want me to structure the question based on the amount of marks and based on the actual question itself? And then once your child understands that, it's about doing essays in a systematic way and then asking feedback in the proper way as well from their teachers, which will then help them continue the loop going forward as well. So those are the 3 elements. And again, like I said before, any subject that you could think of that's academic will fall somewhere in this Venn diagram. Now, this was a really brief explanation on how your child can actually get the top grades, but there's one more thing we didn't talk about, and that is extremely important, and unfortunately, a lot of students and a lot of parents overlook it, and that is external revision. What is external revision? Well, it's not the revision itself. It's not actually the techniques themselves. It's not flashcards and practice questions and all that. It's more, how do you actually go about studying? For example, when should your child study? Should they study in the morning, at night, in school, after school? Should they study a month before the exam, a week before the exam? A lot of these questions have to be answered properly before your child can even pick up the textbook. Where should they study? Is it fine if they study on the bed, or do they need a dedicated space in the living room or on the desk? Or can they go and study in a cafe, for example? With who should they study? Is it fine for them to study with friends, or do they need to study on their own? How should they structure studying? A lot of students just have timetables, but unfortunately those timetables don't work properly. So how can your child actually structure their studying in a proper way? A lot of these questions need to be answered before your child can even think about any of this stuff. Now, if you feel like a lot of this stuff makes sense and you're able to go ahead and implement it, please go ahead and start helping your child getting the top grades. However, if you feel like you might need more support, if you feel like a lot of this stuff makes sense, but you're just not sure how you'd actually go about implementing it with your child, like I said before, the Exam Excellence Blueprint was recently launched. We already have students in the program, students making a lot of progress, students getting the top grades while at the same time studying 4 hours less per week within just the first couple of weeks. And so if that interests you, then go ahead and check the first link in the description. Other than that, there's around 2.5 months left until the start of the exam season, so there isn't that much time to waste. So even if it's not through the Exam Excellence Blueprint, I really, really encourage you to start taking action and motivating your child to start doing a lot of this stuff, or else they might get left behind. Because remember, GCSEs and A-levels are a competition.